Welcome to The Explainer, where we break down what's happening and why it matters. The US government has officially shut down, so we're going to get into what that means, how we got here, and how it actually affects you, from your vacation plans right down to your student loans.
All right, here's how we're going to tackle this. Think of it like an hourglass. We're going to start broad, looking at the big picture. Then we'll narrow in on the specific political fight that caused all of this. And finally, we'll widen the lens back out to see the real-world consequences for all of us.
Well, this isn't a hypothetical anymore. On October 1st, 2025, that question became our reality. The federal government's funding authority just stopped. And that triggered a shutdown with some pretty immediate and widespread effects.
Okay, so let's dive right in. Before we get into the blame game or the consequences, we first need to be super clear on what a government shutdown actually is.
It's actually pretty simple, in theory. The government's fiscal year ends on September 30th. If Congress can't agree on a new budget, or at least a temporary extension, by that deadline, the government legally isn't allowed to spend money. And when that happens, a huge chunk of it just grinds to a halt.
Now here's what's so interesting. Funding gaps, where Congress missed the deadline, they used to happen and it wasn't a huge deal. But that all changed in 1980. A key legal opinion came out that basically said, nope, without a budget, all non-essential work must stop. That single decision is what created the chaotic shutdowns that we know today.
All right, let's get to the heart of it. Why this year? What was the political standoff in Washington that actually pushed us over the cliff this time?
So, at its core, this wasn't just some simple disagreement over a few budget lines. No, this was a fundamental clash of ideologies about what the government should and shouldn't be doing, and it all centered on one really controversial piece of legislation.
So here's how it all went down. Democrats basically drew a line in the sand. They refused to fund the government unless Republicans agreed to undo some specific healthcare cuts that were passed earlier in the year. Republicans said no way. They wanted a clean bill without all that. The temporary funding bill came up for a vote. It didn't get the 60 votes it needed in the Senate, and just like that, the clock ran out.
So you have this political fight happening in Washington, and bam, it triggers this massive disruption across the entire country. Let's just take a look at the sheer scale of the immediate fallout.
I mean, that number is just staggering. To put it in perspective, it's like the entire population of a city the size of Denver was just suddenly told, go home, you're not getting paid, and we don't know when you'll be back.
And yeah, Congress usually approves back pay after the shutdown is over, but that doesn't help you pay rent or buy groceries right now. The immediate economic shockwave from that lost pay is just immense.
And this is where you really see the split. Things that are considered absolutely vital for national security and core benefits, like Social Security, they're protected. But so many other things that people rely on, from scientific research to someone answering your tax question at the IRS, they're just frozen.
Now, you'd think that all this chaos in the government would send Wall Street into a total panic, right? But if you actually look at the data from past shutdowns, the story is not at all what you'd expect.
You hear experts like Rob Howarth point out that, investors tend to look right past all the political drama in D.C. They're much more focused on the fundamental drivers of the economy.
And the numbers really back this up. I mean, look at this. During the 3 longest shutdowns in modern history, the S&P 500 actually ended up in positive territory every single time. And during that last one, in 2018-2019, it was up over 10%. It really suggests the market sees these shutdowns as just temporary political theater. It's way more concerned with the actual health of the economy, things like corporate earnings, than with who's winning a fight in Congress.
All right, so we've looked at the big national picture. Now let's bring it all the way down to the individual level. How does a government shutdown actually touch your life?
Well, if you're traveling, you need to be prepared. That trip you planned to a national park, that's off the table. All those amazing museums in D.C., shuttered. And at the airport, keep in mind that TSA agents and air traffic controllers are working without pay. Historically, that leads to more people calling out sick, which means longer lines and potential delays for you.
Okay, on the financial side, it's kind of a mixed bag. The good news? The Postal Service is self-funded, so your mail is gonna keep coming. And Social Security and Medicare payments, those are mandatory, so the checks will still go out. But if you're trying to buy a house with a government-backed loan, or you have a question for the IRS, you're probably going to be stuck waiting.
Now, for any students and parents getting ready for college, listen up. The FAFSA website is still up and running, so the biggest takeaway here is do not wait. Get that application filed as soon as you can.
Federal processing might be slow, but your state and college deadlines are still very much in effect, and a lot of that aid is first come, first served. You don't want to miss out.
And you see a pretty similar split for our nation's veterans. Thanks to some advanced funding, the core things, VA healthcare, benefit payments, those are safe. But a lot of the other critical support services, like employment help or the GI Bill hotline, they're suspended until this whole thing ends. Okay, let's get to our final section, the big question. How does this all end? What's the actual path to getting the government back up and running?
Well, the usual escape hatch is something called a continuing resolution, or a CR. The easiest way to think about it is like a short-term funding patch. It's Congress basically hitting the unpause button on the government for a few weeks or a few months to give themselves more time to negotiate a real full-year budget deal.
But here's the thing. There's a really troubling twist this time. A memo has been circulating from the administration, influenced by this new Department of Government Efficiency. And it's not just telling agencies to send workers home temporarily. It's telling them to actively plan for a reduction in force. In other words, permanent job cuts. That's new.
And that leaves us with this final, kind of unsettling question. What if this shutdown isn't just a temporary bargaining chip anymore? What if we're watching it evolve into a weapon, a tool used to permanently shrink the size and the scope of the federal government itself? And that is something to think about.